Hello and welcome to every single Wood Elf Legendary Lord ranked from worst to best. If you're not aware, this is part of a series of videos where I'm ranking every single Legendary Lord within their factions in the hopes of one day making a video that ranks every single Legendary Lord in Warhammer 2 from worst to best. Definitely subscribe if you want to see that, because it's going to be a big one and we're getting pretty close to it now. Before I get into any rankings though, I should first go over the rules and criteria. I'm going to be focusing on campaign rather than multiplayer because that's kind of my thing, and anyone can really make anything work in multiplayer. I'm going to be taking into account everything I can that is specific to the Lord and faction. This includes the unique effects they bring to their faction, the effects they have on their army, and of course the Lord themselves and their performance in battle. But first, introducing the brand new Empire Strikes Back, no relation, merch from ColonelDamned's.store. This fabulous design is crammed full of details and characters from everyone's favourite faction, the Vampire Counts. This ambitious crossover combines your favourite characters into a movie poster inspired by the sci-fi classic Battle Beyond the Stars. You can pick up this design on a poster, t-shirts, or even a hoodie, and then you too can become a fashion icon. Here's what one satisfied customer had to say.
Oh yeah, I think it's bloody great. Can I have my 20 quid now?
To top it all off, you could also win some of these items for absolutely free.
It's time for some free shit!
Simply join the Taurox Rampage competition today. All details to this are in the description. Otherwise, if you're interested in supporting this here YouTube channel, whilst also decorating yourself and your walls with the hottest design this side of Sylvania, then head on over to ColonelDamned's.store today, or click the first link in the description. And now we'll return you to your regularly scheduled programming. Now without further ado, let's get into the ranking, starting in 4th place. Surprisingly here we have Orion, and what I've realised during this video is that the Wood Elves are all really close together in terms of power. So first of all, Orion, he starts in Taliesin, right next door to the Oak of Ages, so can level it up from turn 1, which can net you some pretty nice bonuses nice and early. Since you only need to get to forests and can teleport between them using the deep roots, it doesn't really matter what's around you, so starting location for the Wood Elves doesn't really matter as much as other factions. The enemies nearby aren't too strong anyway, and don't pose much of a threat when you combine the magical forest attrition and the large amount of garrisons that the Wood Elves get. So you can leave without having to worry about your homeland too hard. For Orion's faction effects, he has the Wild Hunt event, which doubles the effects of office titles and lowers the cooldown of deep roots for 10 turns. He also grants his faction 10 leadership during forest battles and minus 15% upkeep for all cavalry units. For his personal army, he grants 8 charge bonus and weapon strength for Wild Riders and Stag Knights, and for his starting units, he gains Eternal Guard, which are a tough line-holding spear infantry, some Wild Riders, which are a good early-game shock cavalry, and Deepwood Scouts, which are a nice mid-game skirmishing unit that deal great damage and can easily get around enemies. As for Orion himself, he's a large hybrid weapons unit that does massive damage from a range as well as in melee combat. He's a great choice for leading all aspects of your army, since he's pretty tough with a lot of HP and resistance, meaning most normal damage doesn't touch him, and he can throw out a tremendous amount himself. He obviously has no mounts, and all his items and abilities grant him activatable damage and buffs for himself and friendly units. Now if I was basing this off of starting location, Orion would absolutely be in 1st or 2nd place, since it is undoubtedly one of the best ones in the faction. Unfortunately, starting location really does not matter for the Wood Elves whatsoever, since they are so completely defensible and you can leave them pretty much from turn 1 and they'll be okay. He really gets let down by his faction effects, since the Wild Hunt is very underwhelming since it just buffs your officers and the cooldown of the deep roots, but when you get to the end game, the deep roots basically have no cooldown, so this is kind of worthless. Other than that, he has pretty niche effects that aren't going to get used for most of the time. His army buffs are okay, but again, he's focusing just on cav units, and most of the time you're not going to be using an overwhelming amount of them when compared to other units like ranged. In battle, he is a great fighter, both in ranged and in melee, and is a fantastic choice, but since he doesn't have any magic, he isn't really incredible either, so he's just kind of in the middle. You'd rather confederate him and get him controlling one of your armies than have him as your faction lord. Coming in 3rd place, we have Drycha. Her faction starts in the Griffinwood, which is in the middle of the Empire, so you're going to be fighting versus them and the Vampire Counts in equal measures. It can make it a little bit harder to defend, but in the start they aren't too much of a bother, and you'll only be against a couple of them at a time. Also, they are the only faction which doesn't start in control of the Oak of Ages, so you'll need to get a hold of it via other, more difficult means. For Drycha's faction mechanics, she has quite a few. She has the Aspect mechanic, which allows you to buff your Forest Spirit units in a variety of ways. She also has the Forest Spirit unit, which allows her to recruit unique units instantly from a replenishing pool that are more beastly than your regular Wood Elf units. She also gains minus 10% upkeep for all Dryad, Treekin and Treeman units, but at the cost of 10% upkeep for all Elf units, and they are all also glamoured, which reduces their combat power and makes them expendable. She also starts with 1 Amber. For her army effects, she grants minus 5 to enemy public order wherever she goes, and grants 10% weapon strength and 5 melee attack for all Dryad units. For a starting unit, she brings Giant Wolves, which are a powerful Warhounds unit, Malevolent Dryads, which are an improved version of the regular Dryads infantry unit, and a Malevolent Treeman, which is an improved Treeman that does great area damage, magical, and armor-piercing damage. Draco herself is a powerful single-entity Dryad. She is pretty tough, with good armor and resistances, as well as brilliant melee stats. She doesn't do the best damage in the world since it's not overly armor-piercing, but it is magic, so will cut through resistances with ease. She also has access to Lore of Shadows, which is a pretty top-tier lore if you ask me. She has no mounts, and with all her items and abilities, she grants buffs to herself, a summon, and debuffs for enemies. Now the reason for her rank, again starting location doesn't matter, but not having the Oak of Ages really does sting, and can put a little bit of a delay on things. Her faction mechanics do really shine the most out of anyone, since she leans into the Forest Spirit side of the faction more than anyone else, and it really shows. Being able to summon units from nowhere is really top tier, and the aspects are always welcome. Unfortunately, making the elves worse and not being able to recruit all of them means she misses out on some seriously strong units, so she definitely loses points there. The army effects are decent and buff your spirit infantry, but they aren't the best thing in the game, so these debuffs will only take them so far. She's a decent fighter and does have access to a few nice spells, but she doesn't pack the hardest punch for sure once she runs out of magic. Coming in second place, we have the Sisters of Twilight. Their faction starts at the Witchwood. This is off to the far west of the map, nearby to all the Dark Elves and the recently added Taurogs. They're of course in a magical forest and are surrounded by enemies nearby, meaning you can start to level quite quickly for some nice bonuses. If you aren't careful, you can end up tangled in some large wars with bigger players, but if you keep to yourself and clear the nearby area, you should be able to restore your forest quite quickly before securely leaving it defended by your garrison. As for their faction effects, they have the Forge of Daith mechanic, which allows you to earn favour by winning battles, which can then be spent on purchasing and upgrading items as well as buffs from the legendary craftsman Daith. They also grant plus 10% ammunition for all armies, and the Volley of Kurnus ability for all Hawk Riders. For their personal army, they grant minus 15% upkeep for missile units, and 10 melee attack and 15% charge bonus for flying units. For their starting units, they bring a Great Eagle, which is a speedy flying monster for the early game, some Hawk Riders, which are archers riding eagles for speedy flying skirmishers, and Great Stag Knights, which are a powerful monstrous shock cavalry unit. As for the Sisters themselves, they are a flying hybrid weapons unit. They don't have the most HP, and are definitely not the toughest, but they are super fast and can fire on the move, so should avoid damage where possible. They do massive amounts of ranged, armor-piercing, armor-sundering, and anti-large damage, with the option to change to anti-infantry, and both do a ton of damage. They're on the Eagle mount by default, and can also get on the legendary Dragon mount. All items and abilities grant buffs to themselves, and some active damage. Now again, starting location doesn't really matter, but they have the second worst in case you're really keeping score. The Forge of Daith is neato for items as well as the faction effects you can get, but it sometimes is a little bit underwhelming and tends to get forgotten about and fade into the background. Luckily, that Volley of Kurnus ability cannot fade as it is too much fun and the added ammunition is great. The army effects are great for missile and flight heavy armies, which is pretty common for these Wood Elves. The girls themselves are great ranged fighters, and once they get on that dragon mount, they can kick a lot of ass in close quarters as well, so are great for leading any army. In first place is any other than your boy Durthu, the tree guy. His faction starts in Argulon, and it's pretty much the same as Orion, but he's above the Oak of Ages rather than below it. Other than that, the same notes apply. His faction comes with the Aspects mechanic I mentioned with Draco, which allows you to buff your Forest Spirit units in a variety of ways. He also grants minus 50% recruitment cost for Branch Wraiths, and 10 melee attack for all units during forest battles. For his personal army, all units are immune to all types of attrition. He grants minus 30% upkeep for Forest Spirit units, and 10 to charge bonus for Dryads, Treekin, and Treeman units. For his starting units, he brings Dryads, which are a Tree Spirit infantry that deals magical damage, Wild Riders, which are an early game shock cavalry, and Treekin, which are tanky support monstrous Tree Spirit units. As for Durthu himself, he's a legendary treeman that is massive and super tough with a ton of HP, armor, and some resistances. He does massive amounts of magical and armor-piercing damage in a large area of effect, so can take on almost anything. Just be careful of ranged, since he is such a large target. He has access to the Lore of Beasts, which isn't my personal favourite lore, but is undoubtedly very, very powerful. All his items and abilities grant buffs to himself, and even more active damage. Now the reason for his rank, again, it doesn't really make a difference, but he has the joint best start in the faction. Now the effects is where he gets above Orion. The Aspects mechanic for Tree Spirits is brilliant for buffing these units and giving them a whole new level of effectiveness that Orion just doesn't get. Granted, his other effects are a little niche, but this one makes it work out. His army effects of total immunity to attrition are ridiculous, and the upkeep reduction makes it a lot easier to go for a nearly full Tree Spirit stack if you want to do that. Of course, the lad himself is Grey in battle, with a ton of damage and presence in battles, along with a powerful Lore of Magic to back him up. He might not be the most glamorous or the most exciting, but I definitely think he is the most powerful. And there we go, that concludes my personal ranking for the Wood Elf Legendary Lords. If you have your own ranking, then be sure to leave it down in the comments below. If If you enjoyed this video and agreed with my ranking, then be sure to leave it a like. If you didn't agree and you really hate this ranking, then you know what to do. If you want to see more videos like this, then definitely consider subscribing to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. I'd like to take this time to thank all supporters of the channel, in particular Kobe Said So, for that fantastic support of the Unclean Ones tier. I really can't thank you enough, mate. One more time, thank you so very much for watching, and for now, I've been Colonel Damders, and I will see you next turn.